We have a busy day, a full day for you all, and we want to get the day rolling at least a little timely. I'm Gail Gucci, and I'm the coordinator of the Breast Cancer Conference. I work at Women's Voices for the Earth, which is an environmental justice organization here in Missoula, and we're working to reduce and eliminate toxic pollution. And WEAVE is the main sponsor. WEAVE is the acronym for Women's Voices for the Earth of this conference. But there are many other organizations that helped, and I would like to acknowledge all of them. Blue Mountain Clinic, American Cancer Society, Sierra Club, Can't Make a Dream, Partnership Health Center / Montana Breast and Cervical Health Program, and the Breast Cancer Resource Center. So all those groups came together to help organize this conference. And this is the 3rd annual Western Montana Breast Cancer Conference. And I want to congratulate you all because it's by far the biggest crowd we've ever had. And I want to thank you all for coming, especially those of you who came from outside of Missoula. And I know there's a lot of you. There's folks here from Billings and Butte and Kalispell and Deer Lodge, Bozeman, and others. So I really appreciate the fact that you traveled, and I appreciate the fact that we have a beautiful day because they said it was going to snow today. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I need to run through several thank yous and a couple other housekeeping items before we begin today. But first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge, who we all are in this room today. And because it's an interesting group. Obviously, there's women here who have had breast cancer. There's lots of folks here who work with breast cancer, with women who have breast cancer, so medical folks and other kinds of alternative healing folks. There's women who are interested in this issue and concerned about this issue. There's family and friends of women. And so it's an interesting group, and this is a chance for us all to get some education about this issue and to talk more about what's causing breast cancer. So we're looking to delve in a little bit to what solutions, certainly, but also causes, and look at that today. And so I appreciate the fact that we're a diverse crowd and that you all are here today. I want to thank some folks for being here and for helping. On the WEAVE staff, I'd like to thank Carol Bellin. She's actually out at the registration desk. She's the head person out there, so I'd like to thank her. I'd like to thank Mary Ellen Correa, who's a University of Montana nursing student who's been sort of my right hand in putting this together. And I'd like to thank all the committee members as well. And those folks are, and they should all be in this room, you should wave or something when I say your name, Sylvia Robert from Blue Mountain Clinic, Alex Gorman, who is not here, she's back in New York. I don't think Pamela's yet here either. Pamela Kielra from Living Art, Linda Hightower, who's out doing the coffee, which is, sorry that it's not ready, it'll be ready in about 10 minutes, it was a blown fuse. Jennifer Benton from Can't Make a Dream, Carrie Dewey, no Carrie's in here, Noelle Blagwell from Partnership Health, and Megan Bayless, and who's a university student, and Bruce Kerner, who's not here, from the Sierra Club. So thanks to all those people. Please give them a round of applause. Also, there's numerous volunteers here today that I just would like to acknowledge, not necessarily by name, but there's at least 15 folks here who are helping out, volunteering their time. And speaking of volunteering their time, all of the speakers here today, everybody you're going to hear has volunteered their time and their expertise. And some of them have come from a long ways away, especially our Keynote. So I really appreciate that fact. And, we are a nonprofit. All these groups putting up this conference on today are nonprofit, and so it's difficult for us to get funding. And so the fact that folks donate their time an entire day to be here is really important. So before we even start, if you could give all the speakers a round of applause, I'd appreciate it. Okay, there's a couple other folks I'd like to introduce who took the time out of their busy schedules to be with us today, and they're here with us now. Our senior senator in the Congress, Max Baucus. Where are you, Max? Stand up. A couple of things to note about Max and why he's interested in being here today. He's a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee. And this is the panel, with jurisdiction over any major health care legislation. And on that committee, Max has played a critical role in helping preserve access to quality health care for Montana women of all ages. And this year, something important happened. Max was instrumental in pushing the Breast and Cervical Cancer Treatment Act, which was long overdue, and it was recently passed and recently signed into law by President Clinton. So thank you, Max. And then we also have Nancy Keenan. Nancy, where are you? Nancy, of course, is our Office of Public Instruction's Superintendent of Schools. And, but before that, served in the legislature, and a couple of interesting things about her past record. Clearly a leader on women's health issues. In the Montana legislature, she was chair of the Montana House Human Services and Aging Committee. And in the legislature, she led the fight to pass legislation to prevent insurance companies from discriminating against women, which lowered health insurance rates for women in Montana. As State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Nancy was an outspoken advocate in the fight against breast cancer, producing public service announcements for Race for the Cure. And Nancy also served on the Advisory Committee for Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies, and was the winner of the Bella Wineskin Award from the Montana Women's Lobby for outstanding political achievement on issues affecting women and families. So thank you, Nancy. Okay, that does it for the thank yous. Now I'm going to move on to the housekeeping. First of all, a couple of things. Did you all notice where the bathroom is? The bathroom's back by right where you came in. And there's a little sign that says women. There is a men's room, and there's not very many men here. So if you want to venture in there, you can, but I'd knock first because there's only 2 stalls in the women's room. So that's the bathroom. There's 2 rooms where we're going to be having sessions. Obviously, this main room, and then there's a little library right behind you. So when we get to the breakout sessions, we'll tell you where to go, which room you're going to be in when you choose. There's no actual breaks that it says on the schedule, but you'll notice there's 10 minutes here and there that's built in. So just look for those for breaks. There's several people tabling here, several organizations, and I really encourage you to look at all of those tables and to pick up information because they don't want to take this stuff back with them and it's here for you, so please take a look at it and take it. I hope I didn't miss anybody, but I think the tablers are Living Art, Good Food Store, Montana Breast and Cervical Health Program, Weave, and I think that's it, or maybe one more, Sierra Club, and Story Keepers. So please take a look at all those tables. There's a coat room, so if you want to get rid of your coat, it's back there. There's hangers, you can get rid of your coat. Please do. There's all kinds of food up front. Please have what you like. There is tea. The coffee should be ready by the time we're done talking here. There is a telephone. It's on the right-hand side, my right-hand side there. It's got a little phone sign on it. You just have to dial 9 to dial out for a local call. And then lunch. When we do lunch, we'll serve it out right where all the bagels and coffee are now. So that's where you'll get it. And then we'll come in here to eat. So that's where you'll be. And then the packet. You all got a packet. I encourage you to look in it, obviously. But in the very back of your packet, the last page, there's a salmon-colored sheet, and that's the evaluation sheet. And those of you who are here for CEU credits must fill out that evaluation sheet before you leave and turn it in, and we will give you a certificate. Those of you who are not here for CEU credits, please fill it out anyway, because we really would like to know what you think about the conference, and we need your feedback so that next year we can do it even better. And then finally, I'd just like to thank the Boone and Crockett Club for having us here. It's actually a beautiful location and good parking, pretty good, although I understand it's getting full out there. And the Boone and Crockett Club rents to nonprofits for half their price than their normal price, and that really helps us put on a conference like this. So we really appreciate that. And as for the decorating on the walls, this is a Hunters and Conservation's advocacy group, so that's their decorating, and and we welcome them. So welcome to the conference. Turn it over to Brian. Thank you. This is Bryony Schwan. She's the director of Women's Voices for the Earth, and she's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning. I'm delighted to introduce Mary O'Brien, our keynote speaker. I've known Mary for many years. Mary works for the Ecosystems Project. Let me start again, Mary. You're the Ecosystems Project Director for the Science Environmental Health Network. Mary has worked with many grassroots organizations on alternatives to toxics and risk assessment, as well as conservation issues for the past 19 years. She has taught public interest science and environmental advocacy at the University of Montana's Environmental Studies program from 1992 to 1994. Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1997, just 5 hours after she had co-authored an op-ed piece on breast cancer and toxics with ecologist Sandra Steingraber, who is also a cancer survivor and cancer activist. Mary has a PhD in botany, a PhD and a master's degree, Masters of Science in Botany, a master's degree in elementary education, and a BA in sociology. She's worked for a number of organizations. She was the staff scientist with the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides, the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, Hell's Canyon Preservation Council, and the Environmental Research Foundation. Mary has recently authored a book called Making Better Environmental Decisions, an Alternative to Risk Assessment, that's now available. And it's a wonderful book. I would encourage you to get it. It's a very important piece of work, and I want to give you an example why. Mary's been talking about risk assessment for a long time, and I just returned from Washington, D.C. last night, where I attended hearings before the Environmental Protection Agency on dioxin, which is the toxin that we work on. It's considered the most toxic human-made toxin that is out there in the environment. And it was very interesting because there was a lot of discussion, particularly going on with industry, about risk assessment and whether this was a carcinogen and whether we could say it was caused cancer in 1 in 100 people, 1 in 1,000 people, or 1 in a million people, as if this was an acceptable thing to do. You know, that it was acceptable that we would put a carcinogen into the environment and that it was okay to kill 1 in a million people or 1 in 1,000 people. And Lois Gibbs from Love Canal tells the great story about, she talks about risk assessment and this whole notion about it being acceptable to kill 1 in a million people. As she says, if I, as an individual, picked up a gun and shot into the crowd and killed 1 person out of 1 million people or out of 1,000 people, I would be locked up in jail. But it's okay for industry to do this. So Mary talks about risk assessments and the alternatives to risk assessment, and hopefully new ways of making better environmental decisions, and I'm sure she'll talk about that more in her book. And finally, I would just like to say that she's been a tremendous friend to me. She's not only been a friend, she's been a role model and a mentor. I first met her when I was doing my master's degree here at the University of Montana, and I always thought I was going to work on forests and wilderness issues until I met Mary. And Mary started talking to me about the links between environmental pollution and health effects, and particularly things like breast cancer and chlorine in our environment. And she got me so worked up about the issue, and I kept saying to her, Mary, I hate toxics, I hate science, I don't want anything to do with chemistry. And you know, here I am 6 years later still working on this issue, and it's all her fault because she got me involved in it. But she's been a tremendous inspiration to me and to many other people around not only this country, but around the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary O'Brien.
Thank you. Looking at your program schedule today, I know that at lunch there will be a video, Everyday Carcinogens, that has Sandra Steingraber in it. And I don't know how many of you have read her wonderful book, Living Downstream, an ecologist with the cancer, but she's a biologist and a poet and a cancer survivor. And I thought I'd tell you a couple of stories that would make her feel real close to you. One has to do with her daughter. The other one I thought of when I saw the topic in this afternoon about reconstructive options. And the first story about her daughter, she now has almost a 2-year-old, and the little girl is named Faith, and Faith still breastfeeds, and she's very interested in breasts, which she calls numbs. And recently they went to a county fair, and Faith was extremely interested in the numbers on the various animals, and how big they were, how clothed, and so on. And then she pointed, for some reason she pointed out a reptile of some sort and said, asked Sandra where the numbs were, and Sandra explained that there's mammals and there's reptiles, and it's really only mammals that have numbs. And Faith looks down her shirt, she says, "Faith, a mammal." And as for the reconstructive options, Sandra is built pretty much like I am, which says it all. And she was speaking to a large number of physicians at Columbia Medical School a couple of years ago. And she was talking about cancer, breast cancer, and it was a talk on breast cancer and toxics. And after the speech, there were questions, and one of the physicians raised his hand. He says, I hope you don't mind me asking this question, but why did you not opt for reconstructive surgery? She says, because I had bladder cancer. And I said that they laughed. This is not that proud. Let me tell you the story of a particular scientific experiment that we can use very well to think about toxics and breast cancer. And you'll have to kind of bear with me as I explain it, but there's a reason I'm going into the details. The study, the lead author of which is a woman, Nadine Brown, is entitled Prenatal TCDD and Predisposition to Mammary Cancer in the Rat. Exciting title. A translation of that title is Exposure to Dioxin Before Birth and Increased Likelihood of Getting Breast Cancer Later in the Rat. In this study, the researchers exposed one group of pregnant rats to dioxin on one day only, day 15 of pregnancy. The other group of pregnant rats was not exposed to the dioxin while they were pregnant. Both the exposed and unexposed pregnant rats then had children. Later, when the rat children of both groups had grown up, that is, when they were 50 days old, researchers exposed the adult rat children to the chemical dimethylbenzanthracene, or DMBA, which is a toxic chemical that causes breast cancer in rats. Those now grown-up rat children who were exposed to DMBA as adults and who had been exposed to dioxin prior to birth because their mothers had been exposed to dioxin and passed through the placenta, experienced twice the number of breast cancer tumors as the grown-up rat children that had also been exposed to the DMBA as grown-ups, but had not been exposed to dioxin prior to their birth because their mothers had not been exposed. In other words, pre-birth exposure to dioxin had crossed the placenta from their mother, and it doubled the number of tumors following later exposure to a cancer-causing toxin. Now this is interesting, because one thing we supposedly know about dioxin is that it is not a chemical that causes breast cancer in adults. In fact, if you're unlucky enough to be exposed to dioxin as an adult, as in an accident or something, you're less likely to get breast cancer than if you're not exposed. You might get other cancers from the exposure, such as soft tissue sarcoma or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or painful chloracne or endometriosis or something. But you're less likely to get breast cancer. This has been shown in surveys of residents of Seveso, Italy, where an industrial explosion in the 1980s spread dioxin into the air, water, food, and people of Seveso. Dioxin is a hormone-disrupting chemical, and it acts against estrogen. Increases in exposure to estrogen are associated with increases in breast cancer. So exposure as an adult to dioxin counters estrogen. But something about exposure to dioxin before birth made those rat children more susceptible after they grew up to toxics that are known to cause breast cancer. What happened is that their breasts developed differently after pre-birth exposure to dioxin. The researchers in the experiment found that by the time the rat children were 50 days old, those whose mothers had been exposed to dioxin had less internally developed breasts, which makes sense given that breast development requires estrogen and dioxin is an anti-estrogen. The rat children whose mothers had not been exposed to dioxin had developed more lobules in their breast out of the terminal end buds. Now, we also know that women who have been pregnant at least once have lower rates of breast cancer than women who have never been pregnant. And one thing that happens during pregnancy is that breasts develop the terminal buds into lobules. So not having enough estrogen before birth apparently made the rat children have less developed breasts, which were then more susceptible to a carcinogenic toxic as adults. Now, why on earth am I going into such a long story about one experiment in a speech on breast cancer? Because an experiment is a story, and I think we can learn several important lessons from this story. First lesson is there are lots of ways for a toxic chemical to cause breast cancer. Dioxin, an anti-estrogenic chemical, is considered to not cause breast cancer in adults, but it may very well be contributing to causing breast cancer in adults, because pre-birth exposure may produce cancer-susceptible breasts in humans. Other toxic chemicals may contribute to breast cancer without being breast cancer carcinogens, by being immune suppressants, which lowers our ability to fight off diseases, including cancer, or by being estrogen mimics, adding to our teenage or adult burden of estrogens and making us more susceptible to other toxics that cause breast cancer. Looking at only at exposures to toxics after birth, as most human and laboratory animal studies do, will miss the role of pre-birth toxics in making us more susceptible to breast cancer. Looking only at exposures to a single toxic, as most laboratory animal studies do, we'll miss the consequences of being exposed to one toxic that makes us vulnerable to breast cancer, followed by another toxic that causes breast cancer in vulnerable individuals. Which leads to a second lesson from this story. As we slowly learn more and more about toxics in breast cancer, we're not going to be getting a list that says this chemical is causing breast cancer, and this chemical is causing breast cancer, and this chemical is causing breast cancer. Probably more often than not, almost certainly more often than not, when a woman gets breast cancer, it's the result of a whole series or mixtures of insults. For example, one woman might get breast cancer because of exposure to a particular toxic chemical before birth, and medical radiation as a child, and a mixture of pesticides as an adult, and a depressed immune system from not getting enough rest. This is almost impossible for scientists to unravel in populations of humans who have very different exposures to different insults at different times in their lives. So just because scientists cannot say this toxic chemical causes breast cancer does not mean that that toxic chemical does not contribute to breast cancer. A third lesson. Even when we do know that a chemical causes cancer or contributes to cancer, doesn't mean we can avoid that chemical as an individual. For instance, DMBA, or dibenzomethylxanthrazine, the breast carcinogen used in the rat children experiment, is one of a class of chemicals called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons just means a bunch of rings of carbons with some hydrogens on them and some other things. One place PAHs get produced is by burning gasoline. as when we drive cars to this conference. Another place PAHs are produced is when wood or paper is burned. You can't avoid PAHs by buying organic food or filtering your water in your house. They are in the air you breathe. Most dioxin is produced when chlorinated chemicals and carbon-containing substances such as paper or pulp are heated. When vinyl chloride is produced to make polyvinyl chloride, the plastic called PVC, dioxin is produced. So workers are exposed to dioxin when they make PVC for hospital intravenous feeding or drug delivery tubes. If that PVC tubing is later burned as medical waste, dioxin is produced and released into the air. We all breathe air. The EPA, which Brian is just the hearings, Science Advisory Board hearings on discussions on dioxin. The EPA estimates that people living in the U.S. are being exposed each day to 10 to 100 times the amount of dioxin that they would consider, quote, safe. You can reduce your exposure to dioxin by reducing your consumption of meat and dairy products, because dioxin gets concentrated in the fats of animals, including our cells. But you cannot escape exposure to dioxin as long as we continue to allow the chemical industry to make chlorinated chemicals, which they don't need to, as the International Joint Commission on Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement stated years ago, because 90% or more of chlorinated chemicals are not necessary. Alternatives exist for their use. For instance, most chlorine is used to make PVC, for which there are alternatives. This means that if we're going to reverse the breast cancer epidemic, we are going to have to take political action to reduce our society's insane use of toxics. We can't individually avoid toxics in the air from automobile driving or incineration or a host of other sources. And it won't do to limit our campaign focus to single chemicals like atrazine, a breast cancer pesticide. We have to be willing to look at our entire approach to toxics, such as whether our towns are planned such that automobile driving is the only convenient way to get around, or whether our agricultural and international trade policies drive farmers to use pesticides so our food will be really cheap and competitive, or whether companies should receive permits to put industrial toxics into the municipal wastewater system without ever having been asked to show whether they have any alternatives to doing that. And this leads to a fourth lesson from the rat children study. Scientific knowledge is not enough. In other words, just because research shows that a chemical causes breast cancer will not result in getting rid of that chemical. Remember DMVA, the breast cancer chemical that the rat children were exposed to after they had grown up? Remember that it is one of the class of chemicals called PAHs, which are derived from carbon-based compounds like wood, petroleum, and coal? 67 years ago, in 1933, a researcher wrote about the fact that chemicals derived from or produced by burning the transformed bodies of plants called peat, coal, and petroleum are cancer-causing. The quote, "The observation that estrogenic properties," remember this is 67 years ago, "of a low order are possessed by suitable extracts of peat, brown coal, lignite, coal tar, and petroleum is of interest. But in view of the fact that many such materials are known to contain carcinogenic constituents, the clinical use of such extracts is scarcely to be entertained." That was in 1933, yet most of us still drive cars around. Do we expect industries that have built their machinery and production lines around the use of toxic chemicals and combustion to change when we have to change many of our own toxic habits? We at least should have sympathy as to how hard it is to break bad habits. We have been learning since the late 1970s that dioxin, as Brian said, is an astonishingly toxic chemical. causing reproductive failure, immune suppression, birth defects, behavioral disabilities, loss of intelligence, cancer, skin diseases, neurological difficulties. And yet, how many of us have polyvinyl window and screen door frames? How many of us as health professionals use PVC gloves or tubing? We have to undertake political action aimed at changing the way we relate to toxics if we want to reverse the terror, loss, and pain of our breast cancer epidemic. We need to change how we relate to toxics, and we need to change how we relate to nature. And let me take those two topics in order. First, changing how we relate to toxics. I believe the single most important change our nation can make in relation to toxics is to stop asking how much of each toxic chemical is safe, and instead ask how little of each toxic we need to use. Currently, if industry wants to get a permit to release a toxic to the air or water, the only question answered is how much of that toxic's release is okay. If the agricultural industry wants to put pesticides in apples or on broccoli or in a stream from runoff, the question that is addressed is how much will be allowed. This is determined by what is called risk assessment, whereby a chemical is tested in laboratory animals to see at what dose some health damage is caused. That dose is then compared to some estimated exposure of some hypothetical human to guess whether the estimated exposure is safe or of insignificant effects, or at least, quote, acceptable risk. It sounds like a technical or scientific process, but it is the playground for the imaginations and wishes of industries wanting permits to release toxics and government agencies wanting to defend having given them pure permits. If there's missing information, it is either treated as zero in a risk assessment or else is assigned some estimate. I got out of the business of analyzing pesticide risk assessments and trying to make them more honest when I found that the purpose of their use was not to predict risk, despite the name risk assessment. Rather, it was to estimate the amount of the toxic that would be safe. While industry doesn't like regulations, they do support risk assessment-based regulation because they can endlessly argue about which numbers should be put in the formula. They have the money to run more tests. Indeed, most of the tests upon which risk assessments are made are provided by the company that manufactures and sells the toxic. Regulators or agencies give permits for toxic releases either on the basis of what the company says it needs to release into the environment or on the basis of assessments, which, though shot through with wild guesses and estimations, look objective and technical and professional because they are numbers. And then, if you question the resulting pronouncements that a given toxic is safe, down this road, you are the one expected to prove that a particular number in the risk assessment is wrong. If you go to the effort of proving that, then all the regulators or risk assessors have to do, and I've been down this road, is change a different number in the risk assessment formula, and you're back where you are, and a pronouncement is once again made that the chemical is safe. Risk assessment is the regulatory approach used in this country toward toxics and other hazardous activities, and it must end. The EPA uses risk assessment estimates to justify how much of each toxic can be let out of each factory stack, or how much of pesticide can be put inside apple juice that a child drinks. The Department of Environmental Quality uses risk assessment to determine how much arsenic can be put into the drinking water or the Bitterroot River. The Forest Service uses risk assessment to determine how little old-growth forest is needed to support a spotted owl, how little sagebrush steppe is needed to keep sage-grouse from going extinct. The National Marine Fisheries Service uses risk assessment to guess how many of a particular fish species can be harvested without causing the species to crash. The risk assessment paradigm will approach all breast cancer toxics the same way. as we gradually learn about which toxics are associated with breast cancer. After years of breast cancer prevention research has finally made some connection between breast cancer and some toxic chemical like DMBA, the question then should be asked, for instance, how much DMBA can be in the air without causing more than 10 more breast cancers per million people? But you've already seen that the answer to a risk assessment question like that may depend on how much dioxin your mother was exposed to during critical days when you were developing embryos. Was my mother exposed to dioxin in Akron, Ohio when she was pregnant with me? I don't know. The day I was born, my obstetrician sent me down to the X-ray room to have my thymus blasted with X-rays because the Midwest medical establishment at that time believed that sudden infant death syndrome was caused by an enlarged thymus, and one of my brothers born before me had died of sudden infant death syndrome. Did that make my risk for breast cancer from breathing automobile fumes while I ride my bike around Eugene, Oregon, higher than your risk? I don't know. And neither do any risk assessors when they are hired to estimate how much DMBA is okay in the air. So the automobile industry and the Departments of Transportation and our national economy and international competitiveness won't be harmed. The alternative to risk assessment is to not ask the question how much of this toxic is safe, but instead to ask how little of this toxic is necessary. Let me show how one society can ask one question and another society can ask another question. In the Netherlands, when a company wants to register a pesticide for use in the agricultural industry, a pesticide that hasn't been registered before, one screen that that pesticide has to go through is, are there less toxic alternatives? If the alternatives exist, the pesticide doesn't get registered. In the United States, it's illegal for the EPA to consider alternatives when a company wants to register a pesticide. It's written into the National Pesticide Law, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Weedicide Act, that the existence of alternatives cannot be used as a criterion on which to deny the registration of another pesticide. Another example, Massachusetts has the best Toxic Use Reduction Act in the country. It's had it for nearly 10 years now. It taxes the toxics that come out of the stacks of companies. It requires the companies to draw up toxic use reduction plans. That isn't pollution prevention plans, that's toxic use reduction, using less toxics in the first place. And then it uses the money that the companies have paid for sending toxics out of the stack to fund the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, which then will give free advice to companies on how to reduce their use of toxics. The state has also set goals, which it met within 5 years, to cut toxics emissions to the air by 50%. Since the beginning of the Toxic Use Reduction Act, the toxic emissions out of those companies have been reduced by 70%, and their toxic use has been reduced by 35%. And according to the company's own economics, not even counting health effects and the less medical costs of toxic exposure to workers, the companies overall have made a profit. These are choices that we make. Right now, citizens in Massachusetts, from many organizations, including the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition and the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, and a number of other organizations, are joining together to plan precautionary principle legislation for Massachusetts, in which the precautionary principle will be written into the state regulations. The precautionary principle says that if an activity poses, on the basis of some evidence, harm, it looks like it could cause serious harm, even if you haven't proven through cause and effect, even if science hasn't made an airtight case for the cause and effect, you avoid that activity if you have alternatives. Now, this legislation that is being written is under a 3-year plan as to how to move this strategically through the whole process in Massachusetts. But I think you have an example there of a state that already has practiced with alternatives. and seen that it can be done, and they can really reduce toxics. And so it's not surprising that in Massachusetts, which has the greatest reduction in toxics emissions of any state in the Union, they are now looking at the possibility, and I would say, given who's involved in working on this new legislation, which are the same people that worked on the toxics use reduction legislation, are likely to move ahead as the first state in the nation with precautionary principle written into all their state regulations. Ken Geiser, the director of the Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Institute, who has worked with the industry daily for 20 years on how to switch from one system to another so that less toxics are required, said to me one time, "Mary, after 20 years, I've come to believe that our country could make everything that it makes." Setting aside the question whether we ought to be making everything we make. Our country could be making everything it makes with 90% less toxics. That is quite an indictment of our society. I believe the single best breast cancer prevention step we can take in our personal lives, in our legislation, in our regulatory rules, in our hospitals, everywhere, is to ask the question, is this toxic necessary? We need to build the habit of asking that question throughout our society. Another effort that's going on that is very organized and very successful is the Healthcare Without Harm movement, which is a movement between suppliers of medical equipment and environmental organizations and hospitals and hospital associations. This coalition, which has been going on for several years now, and which I know Women's Voices for the Earth it works with, has as its goal getting mercury and PVC out of the hospital. And it's a very smart movement because while the groups approach hospitals about considering getting PVC and mercury out of their procedures and equipment, it also gets the questions from the hospitals, but how do I do this and how much will this cost? Provides them with the answers. And if there's no answer to something, they go to suppliers and say, you know, I think we're going to have a market for such and such a piece of equipment if you can develop it, or material if you can develop it. So this joining of the environmental organizations really being a broker between the suppliers who can make a profit, providing non-PVC and non-mercury procedures to the hospitals, and the hospitals is an extraordinarily effective organization. So you remember the whole issue of risk assessment. Let me tell a story that I've told many times in different places. I like it because I made it up, and I'm not usually very creative, but I made this one up and I laughed. This woman is standing beside, a woman is standing beside an icy mountain stream, and there's 4 risk assessors behind her. And one is a toxicologist, and he says, well, she ought to wade across the river. It's only cold, it's not toxic at all. And there's a cardiologist standing behind her, and he says, you know, from this distance, she looks young, and she doesn't look like she's hypothermic. She's going to be able to make it across that river without cardiac arrest. She ought to wade across. And there's a hydrologist. And he says, you know, I've seen rivers like this one, and this one probably doesn't have any dips in it that make the water more than 4 feet deep, and it doesn't look like it has any whirlpools to wade across. And the last one is an EPA staffer. And he says, you know, compared to global warming and the loss of biological diversity, her risk is nothing. She ought to wade across. And she says, well, I'm not going to. They kind of roll their eyes. They say, well, she's a woman. We'll have to explain it in simpler terms. And they go up to her. They show the documents to her, and they draw pictures, and they make it as simple as they can, and they say, look, your chance is 1 in 40 million that anything's going to happen to you crossing this river. wading across this river, and she says, I'm not going to do it. And so exasperated, they finally say, why? And she points upstream and she says, because there's a bridge. The second major change I believe we need to make is how we relate to nature. There is no boundary between us and our environment. We are nothing but nature. We are nothing but our environment. And I think this means we cannot save ourselves from breast cancer without saving all life. As Terry Tempest Williams, the Utah author of Refuge, says, we are no more and no less than the life around us. That is not just a poetic statement of respect for all living beings. It is a medical statement. You are a mouse. You are an alligator. The estrogen in a mouse, including a laboratory mouse, is genetically identical to your estrogen. Alligator penises shrink in response to particular toxics, just as human penises do. Fish lose their ability to plan escapes from predators in response to toxics, just like children lose their ability to concentrate in response to toxics in utero or in second grade. When we rinse pesticides off our fruits, we are putting those pesticides into the water in which fish live. When we use throwaway plastics, and I was extraordinarily pleased to see the non-throwaway cups that were available to all of you for tea. When we use throwaway plastics, we are either sending them to a landfill, which will leak and poison groundwater, or we are sending them to an incinerator and will breathe the toxics that result, or we are fooling ourselves into believing that somewhere, someone will magically recycle plastic with no toxic emissions, no worker respiratory damage, no toxic cost to the world. When we are drive cars, we are putting benzoylpyrene, a carcinogen, into the air. If we spend the money and have the money with our privilege to filter the water at our kitchen sink, we then dump what is filtered out back into the water for fish and mayflies and dragonfly larvae to drink, or we send it to a landfill or incinerator. Our breasts are simply one marvelous component in Earth's systems. As a scientist, I do not think we are going to be able to stop the breast cancer epidemic until we make sure all Earth's embryos and longest living individuals are clean. All beings need to start out free of human-introduced toxic chemicals, and at the end of their biological lives, they need to die free of human-introduced toxic chemicals. My understanding is that we have a breast cancer epidemic, and an autism epidemic, and a heart-wrenching loss of biodiversity, and a prostate cancer epidemic, and global warming, because we have separated humans from the rest of our world. We cannot then end cancer by separating humans from the rest of our world. When we take care of everyone else in the world, our breast cancer epidemic will end. I do find it ironic to see people carrying plastic containers of filtered water, or buying a supposedly healthy Odwalla drink in a plastic container. I think to myself, at some level, these people are not accepting the reality that there are no boundaries between them and the world. They do not believe what Louis Dick, an elder with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon, knows when he says, I am the earth, and the earth is me. What is done to the earth is done to me. A recent newsletter from a breast cancer action group in Marin, California, where there's a high rate of breast cancer, included an article on the project they are supporting to find out why the trees in their community are experiencing disease and death. They are making the connection that what's happening to trees may very well be likely happening to them. If we believe this, then our breast cancer action campaigns need to be Earth campaigns, not just breast cancer prevention demands. The strategies and principles behind our breast cancer campaigns need to be strategies and principles that are equally applicable to all other environmental movements. The precautionary principle, which states that if there's spread of harm and there isn't scientific proven cause and effect, then that is a sign to avoid that activity to the degree that we can, looking at all reasonable alternatives. That's applicable to toxics, and I spent the last 2 days here in the Boone and Crockett Club meeting with salmon scientists, grizzly scientists, and mesocarnivore scientists, that's lynx, fisher, wolverine, marten, looking at, we developed a Missoula statement on conservation in light of the precautionary principle. It's equally applicable to human breast cancer and to wolverines. There are the 4 system principles of the natural step, which a number of companies in the United States are adopting. This was the 4 system principles were developed by originally the process of developing them was by a cancer physician in Sweden who saw all the details about toxics and other environmentally hazardous activities and thought, you know, we need to get down to what's irreducible, what everyone has, who thinks long-term, really must agree with. And the statement went around, the question, the search for the principles went around and around through many drafts, through many scientists and physicians in Sweden. And out of it came, and I'm going to be just paraphrasing it, there was 4. 1, we must not put things into nature that will systematically build up in nature. That is, that nature can't keep up with and recycle. Things like polyvinyl chloride or PVC, dioxin, bringing up lead and putting it out in the environment. 2nd, we must not take things out of nature faster than it can replace it. For instance, oil, old trees, gold. 3rd, we must not use the physical capabilities of nature to be productive and diverse. For instance, by continuing to eliminate wetlands or changing forests into tree farms. And 4th, we must provide for the needs of all people equitably. Not all the wants of people for every convenience and every material need, material want, but the needs of people, like the needs for food and water and respect. William McDonough, an industrial architect, asked a question in Yes magazine, which is a very interesting magazine. It's called Yes, Magazine for Positive Futures, which really looks at alternatives that societies and communities around the world are making to current ways of trade and production and living. And he asked in his question, he's an industrial engineer, he designs buildings, and he said he thinks the design question, of course he thinks architecture, but it's applicable again across the board, he thinks the design question we all have in our society is how do we love all the children of all species for all time? How do we build buildings, do transportation, agriculture, consumption? How do we support industry and agriculture such that we are taking care of all the children of all species for all time? Not just our children, not just our species, not just the next 10 years. All the children, all the species, for all time. And there's one last, perhaps overarching standard I am coming more and more to think about, and that is a respectful person standard. I recently had an interesting conversation with a woman who edits the monthly journal of the Christian Scientist. Since I didn't know anything about Christian Science beliefs, I asked her lots of questions. She was explaining to me that she and other Christian Science adherents believe that the world is spirit, that they exist in the spiritual world. She believes pollution won't harm her because she lives in the spiritual realm, not material. But she said, I would work against pollution. Why? I asked. And she answered, because it is out of disregard and greed. Well, I thought to myself, she's right. Pollution is not only a chemical, material process. It is a social, spiritual process. It is the spirit of disregard, disrespect, and greed made manifest. We ultimately have before us the process of transforming our society into a respectful society. I do not believe we can prevent breast cancer without massive political action. This requires debates and campaigns and opposing opinions and sometimes litigation. But if our political action is not imbued with respect, and if it does not lead to laws requiring respectful action toward all life, then it will fail. This, then, is the ultimate link between toxic chemicals and breast cancer. We are no more and no less than the life around us. The chemical life around us, the ecological life around us, the spiritual life around us. Our breasts are no more and no less than the life around us. I thank you all for your courage, your spirit, and your work to prevent breast cancer.
Folks have questions for Mary?
Or thoughts, or... Hi, Tony.
Just a general observation first. I think the point about biology being the crucial element to our biology is exactly right. Question, just a few days ago where you were standing, a diplomat from the European Union visiting from Washington, speaking about economic diplomacy, you mentioned the precautionary principle in the context of shipping seed to Europe and hormones in it. And I was wondering if specifically you could tell us about the problem of data gaps in science, how big a problem that is, and how that informs the policy choices we make today.
Well, this is an interesting one because the precautionary principle, I don't know how many of you have heard of it before, but it's in a number of international treaties. And it's also increasingly in European countries written into laws, principles, and so on, agreements and so on. The U.S. State Department is deaf on the precautionary principle. They bully the European Union. The European Union was planning on having a much stronger precautionary principle statement for the Union as a whole. The U.S. literally bullied them into a weaker one. The contention of the U.S. officially, federally, again and again, is that risk assessment is conservative and so it is precautionary. By making, quote, conservative guesses in risk assessment, that's precautionary in and of itself. This couldn't be farther from the truth. The issue of the U.S. attacking European Union for its refusal to import beef that has been grown with hormones is a classic example. We are punishing, under the World Trade Organization, the World Trade Court is allowing the U.S. to punish Europe financially for not taking beef from the U.S. that has been grown with hormones. They say the risk assessment hasn't shown that it causes harm. Now, this is a classic for the precautionary principle. because what is being used in beef is growth hormones. Hormones work in our body in minute amounts. It's an exquisitely conservative process throughout the animal kingdom. It's why we have identically the same estrogen as a mouse, because it works well. Why change it? But it's used in very small amounts. Now, when you put growth hormones into beef, you're adding hormones into the body that the body may not recognize as not human hormones. That's why so many chemicals are estrogenic or anti-estrogenic, anti-testosterone. The body can't tell for a lot of these synthetic chemicals, whether it's, an internally generated testosterone or an externally one. So here we are putting growth hormones in beef to make beef cows grow bigger faster. And then we're feeding it to humans. And the U.S. is even opposed to labeling this so that people can even make the choice in the market. But science is starting to show, I don't know whether it was Tony that's emailing me, I get these emails from all over. Tony is one that often sends me, passes on scientific studies, but there's some evidence now, women in the U.S. are starting their period earlier and earlier and earlier. And you're having examples where breasts are developing very early. And often when this is, in dramatic cases, you're finding that they were exposed to growth hormones or estrogen or something hormonal. So here we have beginnings of evidence that perhaps, our having been eating growth hormone beef may be contributing to this process of earlier and earlier maturation of children. And it's sort of a no-brainer that you don't put growth hormones into beef and then feed it to humans when you have no evidence that this would not transfer. And yet the U.S. is financially punishing the European Union for making the judgment that they don't want hormones in beef. So it's a very deadly serious issue, this contention of the U.S. that everyone has to come up with dead body in emissions. That's another one that the U.S. in international fora, the U.S. is absolutely opposed to numerical reductions. The USDA is deathly opposed to any proposals that we make plans for 50% reduction in pesticide use or whatever.
What's the argument to justify for them?
That they need to use the toxics. It's going to make the farmers not competitive. It's going to drive farmers, whatever. Again, this is a matter of choice. Denmark has the goal of having all of its agriculture organic eventually. It financially supports farmers when they say, I want to switch from being a conventional farmer to organic. It financially supports them as they make that transition. That's a society that is choosing to go to alternatives.
Yeah, Mike Randy, this is one of the most provocative statements I've heard in a long time. Certainly groundbreaking from the point of view of the state of knowledge. And also, every member of the United States Senate. I sit on the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate after many years. We're very involved in Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. We don't have jurisdiction over different. But what you say about the risk assessment is generally true. That is, countless number of times EPA comes before our committee, talks about risk assessments, and a lot of the analysis is trying to fine-tune the risk assessment to try to quote make it work better, et cetera, et cetera. There has been no one, I'm embarrassed, I think that I'm conservative, who has advocated a precautionary approach to dioxin and other toxics. It just doesn't come up. And there is such a institutional inertia favored now with risk assessment. So against that. It's interesting what Massachusetts is doing. We may, if I say we, I mean Congress, our society, become much more attuned to what you're advocating, which I think is very much in the right direction. The more one could have a better sense of alternatives and how you force companies or others to come up with alternatives. That is, I can see a company just kind of stiff-arming any reasonable alternative effort and say, well, there are not any, or we tried, it's not there. So I'm just curious what Massachusetts does, what ideas you have to pursue, honest incentives to make sure we get aggressive search for alternatives in order to have a result where there's less toxics or less dioxin because of risks.
It's a very good question.
A lot of that is science too.
And it would be really interesting for you to have Ken Geiger sometime come and speak to your committee, because he's a very personable person. He's not a ranter or raver. He's very cheerful. He's very clear also, and very serious. But I think in Massachusetts, what has resulted in so much success, I think, has been this using the emissions taxes to fund an institute that then a company can go to and get help. And sometimes the institute just points them to alternatives that already exist on the market. It also has a laboratory in which you can actually devise alternatives. Now, I'm not gonna deny that industry doesn't like the Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Act. Because, and I think that comes out of a lot of ideological, they don't like to be told what to do. But at the same time, it's very impressive, this review that was done. What Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Institute did was go to the various companies, a sample of these companies, and had them fill out what they had spent on surveying within their plant in terms of what toxics they use, looking at options, instituting options, and reducing their toxics, and after all that coming out ahead, profit-wise. With some exceptions, some individual companies, it will take some years before they recover the cost of what they did. Overall, it was profits.
I myself am not lost in the sense that, industry did find alternatives to chlorofluorocarbons. When it was clear that chlorofluorocarbons were causing breaking stratosphere ozone layer, ultraviolet coming down, bombarding us, causing skin cancer. Companies, DuPont's the main one, for profit reasons, realized they could make a buck, discontinued production of chlorofluorocarbons.
And produced
alternatives. Sorry?
And produced HCFC.
I know, but still, on that basis, it's better.
Absolutely, I agree.
I agree. But anyway, so there is some hope.
Mary?
Yeah. Another thing, I would be thrilled if you would take a look at my book on alternatives.
Well, I said, get your name, that doesn't get your stuff, right?
Mary, while you're reaching out, I want to make a comment about it. About a month ago, we hosted a conference here in Missoula on sustainability, and there were some very exciting models that came out of that for industry. And it was aligned with the natural step, these principles that came out of Sweden. And I want to give an example of one company that's doing remarkable work called Interface Carpets. Ray Anderson, who's the CEO of Interface Carpets, read Paul Hawkins' book, Ecology of Commerce, and started thinking about this whole notion of making products in a non-toxic way that are in a sustainable way, where you're not using massive amounts of natural resources. And they are one of the largest industrial carpet manufacturers in the world. And so what he did is he said, and actually let me just tell a story about it. It's very interesting. He was your quintessential capitalist, industrialist, and so forth. Big guy, big company, making tons of money. And he had to address his environmental health and safety officers for his company on Monday morning. And he said to his vice president, I don't even know I had these people, but I guess if they're keeping the EPA off my back, they're a good thing. But he said, I have no idea what I'm going to say to them. And she gave him Paul Hawkins' book and said, well, maybe you ought to read this, because her daughter had given it to her. And he read it, and he had an absolute epiphany, as he calls it, a spear through his heart. And he went in and talked to his health and safety people on Monday and said, we're going to figure out how to make carpet without ever using another drop of water and without ever creating any more toxic emissions. And so what they have done in the process is they now make a carpet that is laid down in square tiles, so that if the carpet is stained or damaged in any way, they don't have to remove the whole carpet, which is an enormous amount of materials, but just the square that's been damaged, and replace that. And rather than buying the carpet, you get a lifetime lease on the carpet. So if you own a big office building, you buy a lifetime lease on that carpet. It will always be replaced in small squares, so that you never have to worry about it again. And then all the material that is taken out is completely recycled back into the original carpet. And now he's got scientists working on how to make carpet out of cornstarch. And Janine Benyus, who's the author of Biomimicry, is on his dream team. He has his dream team of scientists and artists and things that help advise him. And she's now said to him, well, Ray, if you're going to develop carpet out of cornstarch, you better grow corn organically. And he was like, oh my God, is there never an end to this? And she said, but you have to, because otherwise you might be using more oil in the production of fertilizers and pesticides in how you're growing that corn, and you'll be taking more out of the soil and doing more damage that way. So now he's doing this, and he's going to do it using organic corn. So this is one example of one company, and there are numbers and numbers of them across this country, particularly in Scandinavia, that are really changing the way they're thinking about it. And to get back to your question, Senator Buffett, I think that we ought to do incentives, some kind of tax incentives for these companies to do this. I mean, if you think about us in terms of garbage, the amount of garbage that we produce, if it cost us a lot more money to throw away our garbage, we'd sure start recycling a whole lot faster. And start thinking about the kinds of products we're buying and how much packaging they have. I mean, I try to think about when I buy stuff. For instance, if I go to the good food store, I can go and take back the jars or containers that I've used dozens and dozens of times again, as opposed to going and buying those same products that come in a plastic container, that then come in cardboard, that then gets put in another bag at the grocery store. So you start thinking about reduction from the front end. And there are people doing really innovative stuff. And it's just a question of us being proactive, thinking about it. And I think it's government's role to figure out how to create tax incentives and other forms of incentives to get industry to do this. Because,
I also think it important, one thing industry will often say is, look, if we could make money being less toxic, we would. And research has showed that's simply not true, because they, like us, are creatures of habit. And studies have been shown that if companies have internal audits to figure out pollution prevention or toxic use reduction, or outside auditors who come in with ideas, always the system that has outside auditors that comes in and is in contact with alternatives all around the world results in much more reduction. So I think it's, I think tax incentives is one thing. I think there's a whole, if I had an ideal, it would be a Clean Production Institute in every state in the union that does nothing but search the world for alternatives and so on. It's just hard for us to remember how little we think of alternatives. Think about the toilet that you flush. That is a part of a clean stream that is coming through your house. And what do? You poop. How bright is that?
That's right.
And yet there are some towns in Sweden that will not allow any new office buildings to build flush toilets. They have to have biological toilets. They have built a whole industry around collecting the fertilizer that comes from that. And you think, I think that's the value of international. It's one of the things that internet can do. There are clean production institutes around the world. There are other ways of doing things. And, I think to the degree that we can build into laws that you have to have a showing that you have to pollute the air or the water or put a toxic in a product before you get the permit. You have to have a showing that you looked at alternatives and there were no feasible alternatives. It's a very important step.
Any other questions? We should probably wrap up really soon.
And this note was to me, can you give the audience 3 learning objectives they were supposed to learn from your talk? Required for them to get the CPU credits. I think one of them was to describe the evidence of toxics connection with breast cancer. I think the second was the risk assessment approach. And I think the third was the alternative assessment approach, okay? I don't know.
Anything else? Otherwise, we'll wrap up this session.
Well, on alternatives, the key thing I think of what you said is to emphasize the economic benefits to companies. And the way to do that is through accounting systems that make visible the costs of doing things inefficiently and the savings of doing things efficiently.
I think there's the economics. I also think that corporate executives and business people in corporations also can get into a culture where psychologically it's very pleasing to them. A person, like Brian you described, gets excited about the change they're making. So I don't think it's any small thing that psychologically a lot of energy is spent in denial of what a company is doing. It could be turned into real excitement if there's the whole procedures and the expectation and the recognition of the changes that are being made by a company. So there is the economic, and then I also think there's the spiritual.
Thank you very much.